In this lesson, we're going to talk about monopoly. It will be our first excursion beyond the assumption of perfectly competitive markets and competitive firms. First, think about the key differences between monopoly and competition. In the case of monopoly, there's one firm selling a product, and as we've studied before, in competition, there's many firms selling the same product. There will be intermediate cases as well, cases between monopoly and competition, which we're going to consider. But the first step is to see how a monopolistic firm, a single firm selling a product, works and how we describe that with a model. First, think about why we have monopolies. Why do they exist? One reason is that sometimes government restricts the entrance of other firms into the market. So some municipalities and cities there can only be one taxi service or one type of taxi, and so that really limits the competition for other kinds of taxis. Another example is patents, where an inventor finds a new way to produce a product, gets a patent for it, and then has a right to produce and sell that product as a monopolist until the patent runs out. Another example is what's called natural monopolies. These are cases where economies of scale and production with only one firm gives the lowest cost of production. If average total costs are declining in an industry and you're in a situation where they continue to decline over the entire size of the market, then it's actually going to be cheaper to have one firm producing than many firms producing. That's sometimes called natural monopolies. It gives a reason for one firm rather than many. And sometimes, of course, firms themselves try to get together and act like a monopoly. They may collude to fix prices, so that prevents competition from driving the price down. So there's a variety of cases and reasons where monopolies might exist, and so we'd like to have an economic theory, a model, to explain that. The elements of the model of monopoly that we're going to describe here have been around a long time. Some of them we've already considered. One is that we're going to assume, as usual, that firms maximize profits. We've been there, we've done that, we've explained what it means to maximize profits, maximize the difference between total revenues and total costs. We did that for competitive firms. Second ingredient is cost curves. We've been there, we've done that. We derived marginal costs, we derived average total costs, we know the meanings of those terms. The new thing for a model of monopoly is simply to think about the environment in which the firm operates. In this environment, the firm is only going to be one firm, so it really has control over the amount that's produced and therefore the price. Technically, we say that means the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. And let's look at a picture to describe that. So over on the left is the monopoly's view of the world, of the market the monopoly operates in. As usual, the horizontal axis has the quantity produced and the vertical axis has the price. That downward sloping demand curve is the market demand curve, but it's also the entire monopolist market. So if that monopolist wants to sell more, it has to charge a lower price. It moves down along that demand curve. If for some reason it wants to get a higher price, it has to pull back on the quantity it produces. So for a monopolist, it really can control the price, but of course for higher prices it realizes it's not going to sell so much, and lower prices it'll sell more, and that decision about what price to charge is really the decision the monopolist has to face. On the right you see the competitive firm's view of the world, and that's a view of a firm that takes the price as given. It's perfectly flat as shown in the picture. The competitive firm cannot charge above that price. No one will ever buy it because they'll go to some other firm. And it makes no sense for the competitive firm to charge below that price. It will lose money compared to what it otherwise would. So that flat demand curve is just a representation of the fact that a competitive firm is a price taker. It just has to take that price, that flat price that's given. So the whole difference really is not the structure of the firm. It's not whether profits are maximized. Those are going to be the same for a competitive and monopolistic firm. The real difference is the market that firm operates. Either it's the only firm in the market or there's many firms in the market. Now, given that, we can now study how we're going to analyze the profit maximizing decision for the monopolist. So we're going to start with a picture of the demand curve in numerical terms, a numerical example. And that's what's shown in the first two columns of this table. For a given monopolist can produce different amounts, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers of items of the product sold, And as it sells and produces more, it has to recognize that there's a group of consumers out there that will only buy more if the price is lower. And so for larger sales numbers, 4, 5, 6 rather than 1, 2, 3, the price is lower. And as you go down the column labeled price, you'll see the price dropping from 150 to 140 to 130 to 120 as more is sold. That's just the market demand curve, and that's the demand curve this monopolist faces. Now, total revenue, of course, is just the price times the quantity, and that's shown in the third column. 1 times 150 is 150 if you're producing 1 item. If you're producing 6 items and the price is 100, then you get revenue of 600, total revenue. Now, the new thing we're going to focus on, which we haven't stressed before, is the notion of marginal revenue. Marginal revenue, by definition, is the change in revenue as another item is produced. So, for example, when the monopolist moves from 1 to 2 units of production, its revenue goes from 150 to 280, and that's a change of 130. So we write in a 130 across the 2 to represent the marginal revenue from producing 2 rather than 1 is 130. And then as you notice, as you produce more, 3, 4, 5, 6, the marginal revenue declines. It actually can go negative for a monopoly if it's producing so much that the price has to be so low, it actually gets a decline in revenue, decline in total revenue, and therefore the marginal revenue is negative. So that's marginal revenue. It's going to be very important for our consideration about how a monopolist maximizes profits. Now let's take this table and extend it a little bit. Over on the far left is just the number of items produced again, highlighted in red. Next to that is the marginal revenue, which we've just calculated. We know what that means. And now we can consider the cost picture for the firm. You can see total costs for production. The more that's produced, the larger total costs are. You see the marginal cost, which we've defined before. That's the change in cost as another item is produced. So going from, for example, 79 to 84 costs as you go from 1 to 2 items produced is a marginal cost of $5. And then in the far column is profits, which is simply the difference between total revenues and total costs. Total revenues from the previous table, and now you see total costs. That's just the difference between the two in the profits column. Now, if you scan down the profits column, you'll notice it gets to a high point at 404. So that's the maximizing value in terms of profits. It's the highest profits this firm can get. If it produces less than the amount that generates 404, it's not maximizing profits. If it's producing more than the amount that generates 404 in profits, it's not maximizing profits. So if you scan across the table, you'll see 404 corresponds to a production of 6 units. And indeed, that's the profit maximizing point. Now, for analysis of monopoly, we want to look at the calculations the firm goes through at the margin. We want to consider marginal revenue and marginal costs because it gives us a powerful way to think about the profit maximizing idea. So let's think about that for a minute. If a firm is maximizing profits, then if it's producing another item and the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, it will produce that item. If it's considering, for example, producing 4 rather than 3 items, and the marginal revenue from the 4th item is 9, and the marginal cost from that item is 20, it will produce that item because it gets an extra 70 from doing that. And I just go down the table and you'll comparing the marginal revenue and the marginal cost. So for example, at 6 items, you'll see the marginal revenue is 50, the marginal cost is 48. So it makes sense for the firm to produce that 6th item. But now look and see what happens at the 7th item. Now the marginal revenue is just 30 and the marginal cost is up to 65. So it makes no sense for the monopolist to produce 7 items. It will be losing money compared to what it would be making at 6 items. So the profit maximizing point you can get from comparing marginal revenue and marginal cost. As long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, the firm should produce more. When marginal revenue goes below marginal cost, the firm should produce less. And when marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, that's the profit maximizing position. Now you can represent this idea intuitively as I just have done. And that's the idea that to maximize profits, so if you like, the condition for profit maximization is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You saw that in the diagram, and the example got as close as possible. And you see the intuitive rationale, because if you're not doing that, if you don't have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, or as close as you can get to that, the firm is not maximizing. You can also illustrate it graphically, and that's what this picture does. And this is really a famous picture of a monopolist. So let's study this for a while. It's just taking the same numerical example as in the table and plotting the points. So on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity the monopolist produces. On the vertical axis, we have dollars, and that's either going to be marginal cost or marginal revenue or price. I've sketched in, as the blue line, the marginal cost from the table, and you can see how that's increasing as you go from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, etc. I've also sketched in the demand curve for the market that's downward sloping, and this new kind of idea, marginal revenue. And if you look at the picture, when marginal revenue is above marginal cost, that's not the profit maximizing point. So 4, for example, is not profit maximizing. But once you get over to 6, you see the marginal revenue is just a teeny bit above the marginal cost, essentially equal in terms of a sketch of a diagram. So that's the optimal point to produce. If it produces more than that, 7, for example, you can see right away in the picture, marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue. It makes no sense to do it. So the profit maximizing point for a monopolist is the intersection of those two curves, and we've shown that in terms of just intuitive rationale and now in terms of the diagram. It's sometimes useful to actually try to draw a picture of a monopoly by hand. So why don't we do that briefly in this little picture. So I need a couple of axes as usual. I'm going to put the quantity on the horizontal axis. I'm going to put dollars on the vertical axis. And for dollars, we're going to look at marginal revenue, marginal cost, and the price. And so let's first draw in our marginal cost curve. There it is. And now let's draw in our demand curve. There it is. And let's draw in our marginal revenue curve. There it is. So what we're predicting in this case is that the monopolist will operate at a point where the curves intersect, and that gives a level of production here and a level of price over there. That's the profit maximizing position. Now what we're going to try to do with the same kind of diagram is find out whether the monopolist is making money or losing money, and that of course is going to depend on where average total cost crosses the marginal cost curve. So for example, let's suppose average total cost for the monopolist looks like this. And as you notice, I've drawn it so the marginal cost and average total cost curve cross at the bottom point of average total cost. That's always got to do that by definition. A monopolist firm is the same as any. But now we can compute what the price of the monopolist is and what its average total cost. We've already determined it's producing at that point. And this is very important. To get the price, we have to go up to the demand curve, right? Because to produce that amount, the monopolist is facing this demand curve. And so it's going to have to go up to that point to find out what its price is. There, it's its price. That's the monopolist price. Why don't we call it PM for monopoly? And this would be QM for monopoly, the quantity it produces. And then finally, from this picture, as we've seen with similar pictures for competitive firms, you get the average total cost at that point. And so now you know the price is above average total cost, so this monopolist is earning a profit, economic profits. And the economic profits can be shown by the area between the price times the quantity rectangle and average total cost times the quantity rectangle. So that's your classic picture of a monopolist. And most important thing I think to remember in terms of using a diagram is we get the quantity produced at the point where marginal cost is crossing the marginal revenue curve, and we get the price by going up to get on the demand curve, because the monopolist has to find the price that generates that quantity sold, and then finally average total cost by coming down the average total cost curve. So that's a picture for a monopolist. This is a fancy version of the same thing, and so you can study this and think a little bit more about it, but you can see a little more visibly the downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve, the upward sloping marginal cost curve cutting through the average total cost curve at its bottom point. And just as I went through, you get your maximizing level of production at the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue. You get your price off the demand curve up at the red line, and you get your average total cost off the green line. And there you see the profits in the shaded green area, just as in the sketch. Now, monopolies, of course, sometimes can run losses for a while. This is a picture of what happens then. Look at this picture. Everything looks the same except the average total cost curve is shifted up compared to the last curve. And so now you see the quantity produced is determined in the same way. The marginal revenue equals marginal costs. You get the price off the red line, and you get the average total cost off the green line. And since average total cost at that level of production is greater than the price, the monopoly is losing money. So this monopolist got out to make some changes, get out of the business, who knows, but it's possible, at least for a while, for a monopoly to lose some money to run losses. Now, a real question which we want to finish this lesson off with is, what is the harm from monopolists? And in many respects, economists think of it, the harm is a deadweight loss. And deadweight loss is going to occur because the monopoly actually produces too little. It holds goods off the market to get a higher price. Here's the picture to describe that. So let's look at this picture carefully. Usual quantity in dollars on the appropriate axes. You got your demand curve downward sloping. Got your marginal revenue curve below that in the picture. You got your profit maximizing point for the monopolist that's labeled as at the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost curves. That gives the monopolist output. You get the monopolist price, as I've done before. And now what we want to do is compare that with the competitive firms if they were producing in this market. So suppose there was not just one firm, but there were a whole bunch of firms. And all those firms are maximizing profits. So based on our analysis of competitive markets, we can predict right away what the price and the quantity will be for that competitive market. It's going to be at the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the demand curve. And it's at this point right here in the picture. What's most important is the competitive production is larger than the monopolist production. So basically what the monopolist has done is held back the amount produced by the amount shown in the diagram compared to the competitive outcome. And it has also charged a higher price because the competitive price at the intersection of the marginal cost curve and the demand curve would be here, and the monopoly price would be up there. Now you might ask, what are you talking about marginal cost equals demand? I thought for a competitive industry it was supply equal demand. Well, that's exactly right, but remember in a competitive industry, we get the supply curve by summing up the marginal cost curves for all the firms in the industry. So it's going to be basically the same as the marginal cost curve for the monopolist when you sum up the production of all the individual firms. So that's our prediction, that we're going to be producing too little. And that's creating what economists call this deadweight loss, because this amount that's not produced for that whole region, the marginal cost here of producing is less than the marginal benefit along the demand curve. Remember, demand curves represent the marginal benefit to consumers. So all that item in the area there is really things that would have been beneficial to produce. Cost, marginal cost less than marginal benefit. The monopolist chooses not to do that because it's maximizing profit. So it's a law of the society. You can also see the profits in the diagram, as I've indicated before, and the profits are not part of the deadweight loss. That represents funds that would have gone to the consumers in a competitive market. It goes to the monopolist in this case as form of profits. The real loss, if you like, the loss of efficiency, is this deadweight loss. The firm is producing too little. So let's conclude with what we've learned. It's clear that a monopolist output is less than the competitive output. It's clear from this picture that the price is greater than the competitive price, which is marginal cost. It's clear that there's been a deadweight loss created by the monopoly. And overall, this is an example, the first example that we've come to in our analysis of markets where there's, in a sense, a market failure. It's, in a sense, the market, profit-maximizing market, is delivering a production level which is too small. Now we're going to consider some of the implications of this in future lessons. Thank you.